So this webinar developed out of a need that was identified by our primary care teams, mainly by the social workers and physicians. And then there was this gap in comfort level in doing these capability assessments. So we partnered with Interior Health, and we have Brett here presenting. A similar webinar was, or actually that it was during the time when we could meet as a team, and so it was done in South Okanagan. And I think that one of the benefits that the physicians found was in knowing that the assessment of capability can be a team approach. It doesn't need to lie solely on the shoulders of the physicians. So we hope that this webinar gives you some resources that you can access and a way to share the load in the scope of work. So I'd like to welcome Brett. Brett Butcher is Interior Health Knowledge Facilitator for vulnerable and incapable adults. He's well-versed in the suite of acts that make up the adult guardianship legislation. He provides regional consultation and education across Interior Health related to best practices for supporting vulnerable and incapable adults. Prior to his work as the knowledge facilitator, Brett was a frontline healthcare social worker conducting investigations for suspected abuse, neglect, and self-neglect of vulnerable adults. Brett's passionate about the work he does, and he strives to promote the balance between an adult's rights to make their own decisions and their right to be safe. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Brett. The first part will be the presentation, and then we will go into a case study. And you'll have an opportunity to ask and answer questions. And we ask that you use your chat box for that. If you hover, Leon, I might need to call on you here for the chat box. I think if you hover over the little voice thing in the speech bubble in the top right of your screen, you should be able to contribute to the conversation that way. Correct, Dion?
No, you got it.
All right. So thank you very much, Brett, and over to you.
Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for the opportunity to meet and come together and talk about capability. It's a lot of different stuff I cover under the suite of adult guardianship legislation, and certainly capability and capacity is one of the more complex but interesting pieces of legislation that I assist health authorities and colleagues of the health authorities with. At any point, please don't wait just till the end of the presentation. If you have a question through the slides, just put it through the chat box, and I'll try my best to keep my eye on that and answer questions as we go. So what I hope to cover in today's presentation are a few things. So one is just some of the language confusion around terminology with capability, words that are often used and cause confusion among healthcare teams. And so we'll talk about what those words are and what they actually mean and how they actually mean something different than capability. I'm also going to talk about probably the most important step of the capability assessment, and that's informing the adult of their rights before you actually start conducting a capability assessment on them. We'll talk about the different domains of capability and what the legal tests are for each of those domains. And then after we've kind of sorted through the different domains and the different legal tests and who can conduct them, we'll look at what are the options for who we could go to make decisions on the behalf of the adult when they're found incapable in one of those domain areas. So first, starting with the language confusion. So I often refer to this as the 5 C's. So there's 4 C words that often get confused as capability, but actually mean quite different things. So the first is the word competent. This is a word we often use in place of capability, but competence is actually not terminology you'll find in the suite of adult guardianship legislation, the legislation that guides all healthcare professionals. Competence is actually a word more within the legal justice system. Competent is an umbrella term, and capability fits in that umbrella term, but competence can also relate to things like I might not be competent because I don't show up to my work on time. It has nothing to do with my mental capacity. So it's a word we want to try to actually strive away from using in our documentation to prevent any confusion in case our documentation ever gets used in a court or legal situation. If you think of it as a grammar thing, it's kind of like spelling a sentence and using the wrong version of the word there when writing that sentence. The next word you guys see all the time is that word certification. A lot of times we see certification, people think certification equals incapability, but certification, as you guys would know, refers to the Mental Health Act and the process in which an adult is involuntarily admitted to a designated facility under the Mental Health Act. Not all adults that are certified are equal to being incapable. In fact, if an adult's certified, it's actually a good indicator that they're probably suffering from some psychiatric conditions and requiring treatment, and because of that, it's probably a bad time to actually conduct a more formal assessment of their capability until they return to a baseline or a new baseline. The next word that gets used in place of capability is CI, or Certificate of Incapability. A lot of times in my line of work, people will say, well, we need a certificate of incapability to find them incapable of X or incapable of Y. The term certificate of incapability only refers to one particular, very specialized process when we need the public guardian and trustee, that's something I'll be talking more about, to manage the finances of an incapable adult. There is no such thing as a certificate of incapability for healthcare decisions or care facility placement decisions. It's only ever when we need the public guardian and trustee's assistance to manage. The next word that gets used in place of capability often is consent. An incapable adult cannot consent. Consent is the action of a capable adult. Consent is the process of an adult being fully informed regarding a healthcare course of action or treatment, and through that informing, the adult demonstrates understanding and appreciation. But the word today's presentation is going to be focusing on is capability. Sometimes people ask me, what about capacity? Capability, capacity, these words are certainly used interchangeably. So to start us off, how do we actually start an assessment? No matter what part of what act, of what legislation you're looking at, the standards are always the same, that there are certain fundamental rights that need to be reviewed with an adult before conducting an assessment of their capability. And these are those rights. So the first is letting the adult know that they what they're being assessed for and what is it going to be used to determine if they're capable or incapable of what. That's the first thing. The second is letting them know that their assessment, if they're found incapable, could result in someone making decisions on their behalf, most likely a friend or a family or someone that they've appointed with a legal authority. And we want to let them know they have a right to a support person present, and if they identify somebody, we want to make sure that support person is available and present before we actually proceed with an assessment. The next one I think is probably one of the most important ones, and that's that they have every right to not participate in any formal testing we do of their capability. However, if they make that choice to not participate, it doesn't mean that we can't assess their capability. It means that we can assess their capability based on just collateral and observational evidence that we have. And so that's a really important thing to inform them, that if they choose to not forgo participating, it doesn't stop the process. And then the last one, kind of an obvious one, they have the right to ask questions and receive answers at any time during the assessment. So super important that we kind of go over this checklist with an adult before actually conducting a capability assessment. So the next thing is knowing what we're actually going to assess and why we're going to assess it. So within capability assessments, within the suite of legislation, capability can kind of be broken down into the following different domains. So healthcare decision-making, personal care decision-making, financial, involuntary psychiatric treatment, care facility admission and continued residency, and legal. And by legal, I mean the ability to develop documents like power of attorneys, wills, representation agreement, things like that. So we're going to go through each one of those domains and break down what the legislation says the legal test is and who can act as assessors around that work. So let's start with the most common one, the one that we do most frequently, the domain of healthcare decision-making. So this comes from the Healthcare Consent and Care Facility Admission Act. And there's 3 parts to the legal test. And with the healthcare assessments, there's no actual kind of incapability report or incapability form. The test is simply put within your documentation. There's not like a certificate that needs to be filled out. So to do the legal test, it starts with you having to inform the adult. So if we're using a particular healthcare course of action, we need to inform the adult of the benefits, the risks, the alternatives, the condition that we're trying to treat. We have to give them all the information. And then through giving that information comes the 2-part assessment. Based on the information we have given them, does the adult A, understand the information provided, and do they appreciate, do they have the insight that information applies to them and their situation? If an adult lacks either understanding or appreciation, that would be grounds to find the adult not capable to make that healthcare decision. So who can conduct these assessments? Any of the regulated prescribed healthcare professionals or medical practitioners can conduct these assessments. The Act says that best practice is the person that should lead the assessment should be the individual that's actually going to be providing the healthcare treatment or assessment or intervention. So if it's an assessment by a professional, the professional that's going to conduct that assessment should be the one that's doing the incapability assessment. We'll get into later who could actually step in and make decisions if the adult's incapable, but that is the test there, the understanding and appreciation. Now, the next is a bit of a tricky one, and that's personal care. And when I say personal care, I'm talking about non-healthcare things. So things like choosing what to eat, what activities to participate in, who to socialize with, what to wear, what personal care, personal hygiene, kind of some of our ADLs and IADLs. That's what I mean by personal care. Interesting, in BC, there is no actual legal test around personal care capability. So across BC, what is typical practice is the same test that I just showed you for healthcare is what is often used for determining capability around personal care decision making. And the same healthcare professionals would be the ones, or medical practitioners would be the ones conducting those assessments. And the reason we apply the same test is because what we find in practice is often the healthcare and the personal care decisions go hand in hand. The next is the care facility admission, and this is also out of the Healthcare Consent and Care Facility Admission Act, and this is new legislation as of November November 4th of last year. And so with this, the test is once again about determining the adult's understanding and appreciation. And that understanding and appreciation is broken into 3 areas. 1, do they understand and appreciate the type of care they would receive at a care facility? Do they understand and appreciate the type of services available? And by services, I mean the non-healthcare related things. So things like kind of recreational activities, meals, house cleaning services, those kind of things. Do they understand and appreciate those services? And then the third part of the test is, do they understand and appreciate the circumstances under which they can come and go from a care facility? So, a locked care facility is going to have different expectations than, say, a unit that's not locked. And so that's what we're looking at. If the adult can understand and appreciate all of those things, we would find the adult capable. If they lack the capacity to understand and appreciate any of those, we would find them incapable of making that decision. So with this, we have a little bit more restrictions on who can actually conduct these capability assessments for facility admission or continued residency at a facility. So our assessors could be either physicians, nurse practitioners, registered nurses, registered psychiatric nurses, occupational therapists, social workers, or psychologists. There is a course. It's not a mandatory course. It certainly is beneficial. It's from the Ministry of Health. It's available on the Provincial Learning Hub, and the course is called Consent to Care Facility Admission. This course has 3 parts to it and goes into greater detail on how to conduct an assessment of capability for care facility admission or continued residency. And the reason there's an actual course on this is, unlike healthcare and unlike personal care decision making, there is actual legal paperwork that needs to be completed for this area of capability. And that's this report here. So there's a process associated with capability around placement. And it starts with a different individual, we call under the Act a quote-unquote manager. These would be home health nurses, access coordinator nurses, long-term care nurses, any of the nurses that you would work with IH. And their job is to try to get consent from the adult for facility admission or continued residency. If that quote-unquote manager feels that the adult cannot give consent, then they have to request an assessor, one of the individuals from the previous slide here, to complete an incapability report. So one of these individuals would come to you as the physician requesting an assessment of their capability, and this is the form. There's the form number there, 3910. This form would need to be completed for them to be moved into a care facility. And once again, later on, we'll talk about who would make the decision if they were found incapable. I'm just going to stop there. We're halfway through the different domains, but before I move on to the next one, is there any questions so far about the first 3 domains of capability?
Next is one. Oh, sorry.
Nope. Okay. So next, we'll move on to the next domain, and that's the domain of financial capability. Financial capability kind of splits in one of 2 ways when you're looking at it. So there's financial capability when we believe that the public guardian trustee is going to be needed to manage the adult's financial affairs. And then there's financial capability when we don't think the public guardian and trustee is going to be needed, like a family member is going to assist or another alternative. So let's first talk about when the public guardian trustee is needed. So in that situation, this is probably the most lengthiest, most detailed capability assessment there is. And there's 3 steps to this capability assessment. There's 2 assessments and 1 review. So the first part of this assessment, when we need the public guardian trustee to manage an adult's finances, starts with the physician. The physician has to complete quite an extensive piece of paperwork. It's about 9 pages long. It's called the medical component. And you would get this package, this request from the public guardian and trustee. The purpose of the assessment here is the physician is looking to determine, does the adult have a diagnosis that would make the adult incapable of managing their finances? And so that package, that request would only ever come from the public guardian trustee. It should never come from anyone else. After the physician has completed the medical assessment, then comes the second assessment. This assessment is called the functional. It's completed by a staff we call a qualified healthcare professional. So that's either an RN, OT, RPN, social work, psychologist, or it could be a physician as well. And they do a second assessment, which is about 12 pages long, and that's the functional assessment. Once both of those assessments are done, there's a review process. And that review process is done by an individual from Interior Health who's appointed by our CEO to review both the medical assessment and the functional assessment. And it's actually that individual, the health authority designate, who determines if a certificate of incapability should be issued. So earlier when I was talking about that terminology of CEI, certificate of incapability, this is the one time where there's an actual certificate of incapability. This is the only time when we use that terminology, and it's in reference to this very lengthy process. On average, you're looking at 110 plus days to obtain a certificate of incapability. So this is what the form looks like, and like I said, this is the form that the physician would complete, and this request would come from the Public Guardian Trustee's office. It shouldn't come from anyone else. This is the form. The functional also comes from the Public Guardian Trustee, and this is the paperwork that gets completed by that individual who does the second assessment, the qualified healthcare professional. And this is the actual form that the health authority designate fills out in that final stage, the review. This is the form that grants the Public Guardian Trustee the authority to manage an adult's financial affairs. So then there is financial capability when we don't need the PGT to take over. Maybe like a power of attorney is going to step in, or another family member with another type of authority. So in that situation, here's the legal test for financial capability. So it's a little bit more extensive than health and personal. It's not just understanding and appreciation now, but it's also a question of, can the adult execute and manage the following? So can they understand, appreciate, and execute the value of a business, if applicable, the value of a property, if applicable, their financial obligations to their legal dependents, if applicable, and as well understand, appreciate, and execute their bills and other financial information. So you see here there's a functional component that's added on top of the understanding and appreciation. And the individuals that can conduct this assessment are all the individuals listed here. So one thing I hadn't mentioned yet, but just because one individual can be selected, it certainly is best practice if you're working with a team to use a team approach in determining capability. So like we said at the beginning of the presentation, that work doesn't have to fall solely on the shoulders of the physician. There's a lot of diversity in the professionals there, and different assessment skills and assessment tools can be used to give a more comprehensive assessment of the individual. So a question here about this: how does the patient show understanding of value of business or value of property? So for instance, how that would look in an assessment is through interviewing and screening with the adult. We'd want to find out if we knew the adult had an asset, can that adult demonstrate things like how much that asset is worth? Are they demonstrating that they're maintaining and looking in that asset and not kind of depreciating its value? Are they able to keep up with, say, if it's a home, mortgage payments, property taxes, those kind of things associated with it? A great question. Next, we'll get into one of the most common ones we look at, and that's involuntary psychiatric treatment. Sometimes this could be fit into healthcare, but it's such a big one that we kind of give it its own domain. The testing for this falls under the Mental Health Act, or the determination of capability falls under the Mental Health Act. So, so the legal tests. So once again, is the adult already certified under the Mental Health Act? That's what we're looking at. Once they're certified, we're looking at, does the adult understand and appreciate the psychiatric treatment being offered by the physician on the mental health Form 5 paperwork? If the physician is satisfied that the adult doesn't understand and appreciate the psychiatric treatment being offered to the adult, then the Mental Health Act Form 5, Part B is the paperwork that is required to be filled out. If the physician feels the adult is capable, they would fill out Part A of the Mental Health Act form. A lot of times this work is done while the adult is in a psychiatric facility. This is the one domain of capability that other healthcare professionals cannot make that determination on. It has to be a physician. And the reason that is because it's the physician that's prescribing and determining what the psychiatric treatment is, and therefore the capability that goes along with that. So, here's the difference. I said, there's that language different. You'll see that certification and the criteria for it actually really has nothing to do with incapability. And so adult could certainly be certified and still be found capable. But when you go over to the Form 5 here, you'll see it talks about Part A and Part B, and Part B is what's filled if the adult is believed to be incapable of consenting to that psychiatric treatment. And then the last domain, this actually falls not to us, but physicians are often asked to comment on it. But when we talk about legal tests, the tests will vary depending on what legal tool you're looking at, if it's a POA, a will, a representation agreement. But the legal testing for that actually should fall to lawyers or to notaries, but it is common practice that they will ask for a written opinion from physicians around capability to support their assessments that they're leading towards. So don't be surprised, obviously, if you get a lawyer or notary asking for an opinion, but just know that it is a lawyer's or notary's responsibility to make that determination when it comes to legal documents. So next we're going to get into kind of the final part of my presentation here, and that's just with the different domains, if an adult's incapable, who can you go to? So starting with health, the highest ranking is obviously a capable adult. The next highest ranking is a commontia person. These are extremely rare, but a commontia person is obtained by a family member or friend through the court system, through a judge. To obtain one requires 2 medical affidavits from physicians speaking to the adult's incapability. But when a commontia person is obtained, it actually allows the appointed person to make all health care and all personal care decisions on behalf of the incapable adult. The next highest hierarchy we have for health is advanced directives. So an advanced directive has to be created in advance, obviously, when the adult still has full capacity. An advanced directive can only be done for healthcare. It can't be done for other domains, and it has to be specific to be valid. It has to be specific to a particular course of action or treatment with a specific direction on how to proceed. If it's not specific, healthcare professionals are not expected to follow it. But advanced directive has to be followed by, when done correctly, has to be followed by healthcare professionals and the people acting on the adult's behalf. Next up, we have representation agreements. It's the next highest in the hierarchy. There's 2 types of representation agreements. Representation agreement section 9, where an adult has to have full healthcare capacity to do it. A representation agreement 9 allows you to make all healthcare decisions and personal care decisions. And then you also have a representation agreement 7. Representation agreement 7 has some limitations, and the reason it has limitations is because the test of capability to create it is a lower test of capability. I kid you not, the test is, can they identify a person that they want to have assist? Can they, do they understand that person will be able to make decisions on their behalf? They don't even have to understand the full scope of those decisions, but do they understand that they'll be able to make decisions? And is that relationship characterized as a relationship of trust? That is the test that a lawyer or notary is applying when doing a Rep 7. And because of that lower threshold of capability, there are limitations to what a Rep 7 can do. So those limitations include for health, that they cannot make decisions to remove life-sustaining healthcare supports, and they cannot authorize restraint for healthcare, and for personal care, they cannot make care facility admission decisions. And so there are some limitations with the Rep 7 that the Rep 9 does not have. And then if there's no planning done, obviously everyone knows about the hierarchy of the temporary substitute decision maker. And then if we have nobody available as a TSDM, then our next and last resort is we can go and contact the public guardian trustee for their 1-800 service, and they can make a healthcare decision on behalf of an incapable adult. Personal care, kind of went through them, but highest ranking capable adult, that comity of person, and then those rep agreements. And I mentioned the limitations with the rep 7 is into accommodations, like they cannot admit an adult to a care facility where a rep 9 could. For other domains, financial legal. So I kind of put those two domains together because the documents are the same. Obviously, a capable adult is the highest. The next highest is comity of estate, and there's two ways to get a comity of estate. So one is through that public guardian trustee, that certificate of incapability process. That is the type of authority the PGT ends up with when we do that process. The other way is if the adult has family, just like getting a comity of person, families or friends can go to court to get a comity of estate. Obtaining a comity of estate is different than a comity in person in that it would be only to be able to make their financial and legal decisions on the adult's behalf. And if we don't have that, then we have the enduring power of attorney, which allows the appointed person to just make financial decisions, essentially pay bills, manage assets, those kind of things. And then if we don't have a power of attorney, we have the pension trustee, which allows the appointed person just to manage pensions and do taxes, and then obviously informal supports like joint bank accounts. So that's our hierarchy of options when we find an adult incapable for financial or legal. For care facility admission, if we find them incapable, our hierarchy is there. We've mentioned all of these so far: the comity of person, the rep 9, but not the rep 7, the substitute decision maker, and the public guardian and trustee. So just kind of, this is my last slide, and then I think I'll take some questions before we move into a case study. Best practices for assessors. So best practice, the main thing I want to emphasize here is that team approach. As you saw through the slides, there's a lot of other professionals that should be and could be working with you as physicians to use a team approach and making that determination in capability. When we find an adult incapable, the next point I want to make is that just because an adult's incapable doesn't mean we start working to whatever outcome we think is best. We still want to consider the adult's wishes when working with their substitute decision maker, whoever that may be, when making decisions on their behalf. A strong assessment consists of 4 parts. One is the collateral we obtain, our interview with the adult, our assessment tools. Our assessment tools, I'll go back to interview for a second. Our interview consists of questions that look at understanding, appreciation, and ability to execute tasks. Those are kind of the 3 things we want to look at with our interview and our screening questions of the adult. Assessment tools, no law says a particular assessment tool must be used. It's your judgment call to determine what assessment tool seems appropriate for the domain of capability that you're assessing. And then the last is using observational evidence. What do you witness? What do you see that speaks to the adult's capability or incapability to make a decision in a particular domain? So I have a case study, but before that, I'll just open it up to questions. Yeah, so a question just asking to repeat the limits of a Rep 7. So the limits with the Rep 7 are 1, they cannot make decisions to remove life-sustaining healthcare supports. 2, they cannot authorize restraints for healthcare. And 3, they cannot make decisions around care facility admission or continued residency. Any other questions? Okay, if there's no other questions, I'm going to present a case study. What I would like for people to look for in this case study is look at the domains. What domains do you think of capability need to be addressed? That's my first question I'm going to ask. The second question I'm going to ask is, who could you draw upon to help inform and assist you in your assessment of capability? And then my third question I'll ask is, what might be some of the challenges of conducting an assessment of capability for this case? So bear with me as I read through this case here. This is a case study from some training we do for some of our staff at IH. It comes from the module on capability assessing. So Mr. Aragon is a 67-year-old. He lives in a bachelor suite in a seniors apartment building close to the hospital and where he lives. He is well known to community mental health services for chronic depression. He also is being diagnosed with Marfan syndrome, and he's estranged from his ex-wife. Mr. Aragon is socially isolated. In the past, Mr. Aragon has repeatedly canceled home support services, citing inability to pay as the reason. The home support workers have reported that Mr. Aragon is difficult to engage and gets irritated easily. Mr. Aragon seemingly can spend days just sitting at his kitchen table. Mr. Aragon seems to worry a lot about his finances, but he will not talk about saying when he's worried too much, he does not eat and make statements like, "I just want to die," and "I have no reason to live." Mr. Aragon has been in hospital several times in the last few months, admitted under the diagnosis of failure to thrive. He's deemed capable by the attending physician at the time. He refuses to engage with social work to discuss his worries about finances. He is only in receipt of old age security and did not seem to be in receipt of guaranteed income supplement. At each discharge, Mr. Aragon agrees to follow with home support and the community mental health team. However, upon the admission, the mental health team and the building manager request that Mr. Aragon be considered for facility placement, as he seems to thrive in the structured environment of a hospital setting. The acute care multidisciplinary team is in agreement with this request. For weeks, Mr. Aragon refuses to speak with social work about facility placement. He also refuses to provide any specific financial information. One day, he finally agrees to facility placement. When the building manager and the mental health case manager meet with Mr. Aragon and the social worker. However, a few days later, when presented with the requested paperwork to sign, Mr. Aragon refuses to sign the paperwork. They're talking about facility paperwork there. A few weeks later, Mr. Aragon signs the paperwork for facility placement. However, on the day of discharge, he actually refuses to go to care. The receiving facility refuses to admit him, and so Mr. Aragon is discharged home. So, any questions about this case study before I kind of start posing questions or comments? So as I read that case study, what are your thoughts? Is there particular domain areas of capability that you feel need to be looked at for Mr. Aragon, and how come? Those domains were health, personal, financial, psychiatric, legal, and care facility. So from my perspective, the areas that I think, the first thing I would like to speak to is, with a condition like Marfan syndrome, my understanding is it's extremely painful, quite difficult to live with. He's got chronic depression. So one of the things I'd want to rule out before getting into formal capability assessment is how is his pain control, how is his depression being managed? Because those kind of things are going to be kind of red herrings, things that kind of lead us astray and could actually make him seem more incapable than he actually is. So I think before we get into any formal capability testing, you'd want to look at his pain management, and you'd want to look at how he's coping and managing with his depression. One of the big red flags in this case is kind of the come again, go away kind of responses, signing up for things or signing paperwork, refusing to go, signing paperwork, refusing to go. And so that's a red flag indicator that would speak to the need to do some capability assessing. So areas that we might want to look at is, one of the things that came up is around here where it says he's not in receipt of his guaranteed income supplement. So there's some question about his ability to execute his financial management. So one domain we'd want to look at is around his financial capability, because he might need something like a pension trustee to assist him and manage his finances. It looks like he's qualifying for long-term care, but he's fluctuating in his responses. Here, he signed the paperwork, he's refused the paperwork. So certainly that kind of inconsistency could certainly be kind of grief, not sure if he's ready, but it also, with the combination of other things, might be a need to look at his capabilities. So another area we'd want to look at, and I'm not saying he is incapable of this, but we would want to look at his ability to understand and appreciate that care facility decision as well. So those are kind of two areas that I picked up on. What about who could assist as you read this case? Who do you I don't think this should always fall just to physicians. There's a lot of work to be done with this individual. Certainly, I would hope that physicians are a kind of central key piece of this capability assessing and this work. But who could you partner with? Who could be of assistance in kind of getting some of that collateral, maybe doing some additional testing to make these determinations? Yeah, I think so. Just a comment here: the mental health team. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And to my previous point, kind of addressing that depression before getting into formal testing. So they would be really important to ally with around the capability areas for this adult for sure. Looks like they have some history with them. History is always value in that collateral collection of information. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. Another comment here, the strange wife. Certainly a great source for collateral information. The one thing you always want to be cautious, though, with people that are strange is taking that information with a grain of salt. What is the dynamics, right? And so, but certainly, yeah, they could be a good get good collateral information. You can find from that strange wife how much she was assisting him with his ADLs and IADLs ahead of time. Another comment here, social work. Absolutely, looks like social work's been quite involved in this case, especially around some of the financial components. So they probably would have some insight into this fellow's, especially his executive ability to execute and manage his finances. They could probably do some testing for us as well to look at that a bit more. Absolutely. Yeah. Some professionals that aren't mentioned in this case study that could be of benefit to, if he's going to long-term care, he would have probably a community nurse involved who had done some previous testing, had that consent conversation about placement ahead of time. That would be another good individual to partner with. There's a lot of question of his functioning ability as far as his capabilities is concerned. Occupational therapy could be also called in to do some more cognitive functional testing, and see, it's all this team information starts to allow you as a physician to, in addition with your own interviews and your own assessments, to make a pretty detailed assessment of capability. So my next and kind of final question, and then I'll open it back up for questions one more time. What might be, like, I know I'm presenting what could be pretty extensive work here, and what are some of the challenges you guys face with cases like Mr. Aragon or other cases? What are some of the challenges you run into with capability assessments? How do you address those challenges as they come up? Yeah, it's a really good comment here. Poor expressive language skills in patients with cognitive impairments. Yeah, that certainly limits our ability with our standardized assessment tools significantly. A lot of the standardized assessment tools don't take into consideration that poor language skills. My suggestion for those situations is, you have to put a little bit more weight on your own personal interview, kind of the unstructured questioning you do, as well as the collateral and observational evidence that you obtain. In those cases in particular, we can't put as much weight on our standardized assessment tools because they won't be as fulsome as we'd like, for sure. That's a really good point, and certainly a very challenging those are very challenging cases. Those are also cases where there's some tools within the occupational therapy toolbox that, with their training and their expertise, that could be beneficial in assessing capability. Really good point. Any others? So I'll tell you the biggest challenge I see. The biggest challenge I see is, oh, here we go. Here's another one here. Yeah, really good comment. Another comment here that through the process, the patient changes their mind and they don't wish to engage in assessments. Certainly that comes up a lot, and it can certainly be a significant problem if we didn't inform them of their rights in the process, right? And so that's why I mentioned earlier that one right in particular about letting them know that they can stop at any point, but the assessment will continue based on collateral observation. That's a really important piece to remind the adult of, because certainly if you didn't have that kind of preliminary conversation, it puts you in a very awkward situation to continue. Yeah. The biggest challenge I see is actually around rights, and that's a lot of times, when we're requested to do, or when I would presume when you guys are requested to do these assessments, you have pressure from family, friends, or even us within the health authority to find these adults incapable, to make life easier in the management of their care. But I would presume there's times where you find them either still capable or find them not living at significant enough risk for us to kind of impede their life choices and their life decisions. And so sometimes just the pressure that comes from external sources can be quite challenging. And that's another reason why that team approach is beneficial, kind of share the burden of that work. There are some principles that I live by from the Act, which are pretty helpful when dealing with kind of, those family pressures or those system pressures around finding adults incapable and so forth. And those principles are: one, no matter what interventions we come up with, they have to be the most least intrusive, most effective type of interventions. 2, every adult has the right to live in the manner they wish, as long as they're capable and they're not harming others. And 3, all adults are presumed capable until otherwise demonstrated. These principles can be quite helpful and are useful reflective tools, and they come straight from the legislation when you're getting those pressures from those external sources. So we just got a few more minutes here. Is there any other questions about capability work, or about legislation in general, or about IH services? Yeah, a question here about what standardized assessment tools should we be using. Certainly, that's a really difficult question to answer. It's a good question. There's no kind of must-use assessment tools. I think it is mostly a preference as to what you're comfortable with and what you think makes the most sense for that particular assessment you're doing. With that said, there's Dr. Deb O'Connor. She's done some work for the Public Guardian and Trustee, and she's written a report on reviewing a bunch of different assessment tools used in BC and which assessment tools are beneficial for which domains of capability. And she came up with 3 gold standard tools. For financial, what's called the FACT assessment, FACT, was considered the best assessment tool for looking at financial capability. For healthcare, and honestly, I mentioned this, but it's not an assessment tool I've been able to obtain, but what's called the MACAT, MAC-AT, was considered the best for healthcare. And then the other one, which I think is beneficial for health and personal and for facility placement, but she found it the best for personal, is what's called the ACE, capital A, capital C, capital E, capital D. And I do have a copy of the ACE, and I can share that if you'd like. But the ACE was considered the best for that kind of personal care domain. Other than that, certainly use of tools like the Mini Mental and MOCA are totally fine tools to use. They definitely did well in the research from Dr. O'Connor. They were part of the tools that were assessed and reviewed. I think the key thing is no matter what assessment tool you're using, you shouldn't use it in isolation to make a determination of capability. It needs to be used in conjunction with your interviewing, with your collateral, your observation, your diagnosis of the adult. Any other questions? So I'm just going to type my email into the chat box here. Certainly, if you have any questions after this presentation, don't hesitate to send me an email, ask a question. Yeah, certainly available to assist in any way. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending, Brett. I was just going to say you're missing the R after interior there on your email in case anyone cuts and pastes it, but it's the regular interior help.
Yeah. Typed a little bit too fast there.
Thank you very much for your time, everybody. I hope this was helpful to you, and because there's a lot of information to remember, this will be posted on Pathways with some of the resources that Brett has mentioned. So please send your colleagues to Pathways to find the information if you find that they're running into trouble with this assessment. Thanks for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your beautiful evening. Brett, thank you very much for your time and for reaching out to the East Kootenays. We really appreciate you giving this talk here.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Liz. I really appreciate it, and I hope everybody has a nice evening. Take care.
Hey, good night, everybody.